You know, when it comes to the holidays, it's the rituals, I think, the things that we do over and over every year that help add richness and meaning for us. Constance and Joshua Greenpasture have a ritual they perform on the Saturday after Thanksgiving every year. They climb up in the attic and they haul down the manger scene that Constance Greenpasture's father made with his own hands out of 3/4-inch plywood back in the 1940s, just after he got home from World War II. It's big and it's heavy, life-size figures of Joseph and Mary and the wise men and the shepherds, a couple of sheep. There's the donkey that Mary rode into Bethlehem on, and there's one camel. It sort of represents all three camels for the three wise men. He always meant to make the other two, but he just never got around to it, and, time got away from him, and then eventually he died and left his legacy to his daughter and her husband. The idea for this manger scene came to him somewhere in France one night, curled up in the bottom of a foxhole, listening to the explosions and feeling the ground shake and rumble underneath him, almost buried there in the dirt of France, hearing the screams of other men around him and seeing the sky lit up with the explosions. He found himself thinking of his church back home, the Wildwood True Bible Church of Jesus Christ, non-affiliated. And that last Sunday he'd been there with his wife and his little baby girl, singing in the garden. And the thought of it kept him from panicking. Lying there in the bottom of that foxhole, he promised God that if he got home in one piece, he would make something beautiful for that church. And he spent that whole night just thinking about how Joseph would look and how Mary would be kneeling and how he would make the wise men and paint bright, brilliant colored robes on them and sort of earth tone colors on the shepherds. He'd have one of them holding a lamb. Planning this manger scene helped to keep the panic away all that night. He did come home in one piece, and he created that life-size manger scene out of 3/4-inch plywood. And ever since, every Christmas, it has stood in front of the Wildwood True Bible Church of Jesus Christ, non-affiliated. Constance considered it a sacred duty to take care of her father's creation now that he was gone. With Joshua's help, they carried it down from the attic and unwrapped it from the old sheets and blankets they put around it every year, and it seemed to get heavier and heavier as they got older, but they took care of it. They loaded it in the pickup truck and carried it over to the church and set it up the same way every year out in front of the little church building. They always mixed the shepherds and the wise men up. Some people said they should have the shepherds on one side and the wise men on the other, but they didn't think that was right. They didn't want the rich to be on one side and the poor to be on the other. They thought that it should all be mixed up the way Jesus called us all together. Lately, they realized that the figures were looking a little, she didn't want to say shabby. That didn't seem respectful, but they sure needed some repair. She admitted that. The December rains had soaked up into the hems of the wise men's robes and sort of discolored the paint and warped the wood down there. One of the donkey's legs was broken clean off. That happened during a touch football game on the church grounds one year. The paint was all over faded. One of Joseph's eyes was faded completely away, so it looked like he was sort of winking at his little baby in the manger. Constance and Joshua had talked about fixing it up, but somehow it seemed wrong to her to paint over what her father had so carefully and lovingly painted back in the 1940s. So they just kept it from year to year and loaded it all in the pickup truck, and on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, they drove over to the church for their annual ritual. When they got there, they faced a terrible surprise. There was Pastor Billy Mitchell, the new little preacher who had been at the Wildwood True Bible Church of Jesus Christ, non-affiliated now, for almost a year, and there was his youth group. That's one of the things he decided to do when he got to the church, revive the youth group. There were hardly enough youth to make an actual group. Since Dr. Venable had grown so old, not many young couples had joined the Wildwood True Bible Church of Jesus Christ, non-affiliated, and most of the members there had just grown old with Dr. Venable. But Pastor Billy was young, and he had a young wife, and they hoped to bring in some young families, and he thought a youth group would help. So they'd been meeting for most of this year. Besides meetings, they had a lot of service projects too. They challenged the youth to find ways to raise money, babysitting, raking leaves, mowing yards for the older folks, and they had planned to purchase a surprise for the church. And there they were, the Saturday after Thanksgiving, in front of the church, setting up their surprise, a brand new outdoor manger scene, plastic and lighted from the inside. There were Mary and Joseph with electric cords coming out of their heels, and there were the wise men and the shepherds, and not one camel, but 3 camels. Constance and Joshua just sat in the cab of their pickup truck for a while. Constance later said she felt like she couldn't even breathe, like all the breath had just been knocked out of her, like somebody had just kicked her in the stomach. They just sat and watched. And finally, Pastor Billy saw them, and he walked over. Constance rolled down her window, not knowing what she was going to say. Pastor Billy said, "I noticed when I came last Christmas to this church that the old manger scene looked like it had seen some real wear and tear. The youth really worked hard to get this new set. What do you think?" Constance sat for a moment in the cab of the pickup truck, took a deep breath, and said, "I think it would look better if you mixed the shepherds and the wise men, so all the rich aren't on one side and the poor on the other, so it's more like Jesus taught us to be." And Pastor Billy smiled at her and said, "What a great idea." And she and Joshua drove home. They set her father's manger scene up in their own front yard that Christmas, and she wondered if Christmas would come at all that year.